Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah. Let's begin chapter 4 of Fanchon the Cricket by George Sand. Sylvanette returned to his mother to cling to her apron string like a child, and never stirred from her side the whole day, speaking constantly of Landry, of whom everything served to remind him. In the evening his father accompanied him to La Priche, fearing to trust the twins alone. Sylvanette was almost wild with impatience to see his brother, and in his hurry to set out could not touch a morsel of supper. He felt sure Landry would come to meet him, and kept imagining that he saw him in the distance, but though Landry would willingly have done so, he dared not stir, lest he should be laughed at by the boys and girls of La Priche for this twin affection, which they looked upon as a sort of malady. Therefore Sylvanette found him at table, eating and drinking as heartily as though he had lived all his life with the Caillots. But so soon as Landry saw Sylvanette, his heart bounded with joy, and it was with difficulty he could restrain himself from upsetting table and bench to get at him the more quickly. Nevertheless, as his employers were curiously watching him, amused with their singular affection, this phenomenon of nature, as the schoolmaster of the place called it, he remained seated. When at last Sylvanette threw himself into his arms, embracing him with tears, and pressing him to his bosom as a bird presses to its nest, Landry, in the midst of his own happiness, could not help feeling vexed, and desiring to appear more reasonable than his brother, signed to him from time to time to restrain his feelings. What did he do, like... a circumstance which greatly surprised and distressed Sylvanette. Yeah, I get it, Sylvie. At length, the two farmers sitting down to chat over a measure of wine, the twins effected their escape, Landry desiring to caress his brother in private. It's a translation, okay, people, don't get excited. But this was not to be, for his young friends continued to watch them in the distance, while Solange, the younger daughter of Farmer Caillot, an inquisitive and mischievous child, followed them on tiptoe, laughing with a confused air when detected, but never offering to turn back, in the vague expectation that she was about to witness something singular in the friendship of the two brothers, though what she could not imagine. Sylvanette, though surprised at the tranquil air with which his brother had met him, never dreamed of reproaching him, so happy was he to find himself once more by his side. The morrow being Sunday, Landry, released from all duty, set out for La Coste so early in the morning that he thought he should catch his brother in bed. But though Sylvanette was usually the heavier sleeper of the two, he woke as Landry passed through the gate of the orchard, and as though some instinct had told him that his twin was approaching, ran out barefooted to meet him. This day was to Landry one of perfect enjoyment. He was delighted to be once more with his family, and enjoyed it all the more that he knew it could not be of daily occurrence, but must be looked upon as a reward for good conduct. Sylvanette, on his part, forgot all his sorrows till long after day was gone. At breakfast, he thought to himself that he should dine with his brother, but when dinner was over, and he reflected that summer would be the last meal, he began to grow restless and anxious. He petted and caressed his brother more tenderly than ever, giving him the best of everything, the crust of his bread and the heart of his lettuce, and then attended to his clothes and shoes, as though Landry were going on a long journey, and as though his twin were the one to be pitied, without suspecting that he was himself the real object for sympathy, since he was the one most afflicted. A week passed thus, Sylvanette going to see Landry daily, and Landry stopping with him for a few moments whenever he chanced to be in the neighborhood of La Coste. Landry growing more and more reconciled to his lot, Sylvanette not reconciled at all. It sounds like my last breakup. But counting the days and even the hours like a soul in torture. Yep. No one in the world save Landry could induce his brother to listen to reason. The mother, therefore, had recourse to him to tranquilize Sylvanette's mind. Still, from day to day, the poor boy's sorrow increased. He could no longer play, and only worked when commanded. And though he still took his little sister to walk, he seldom spoke to her or thought of answering her. simply taking care that she did not get into mischief. And as soon as he could make his escape, he would steal away alone and conceal himself so effectually that no one could find him. His sole consolation consisted in wandering through the lanes and meadows where he had been accustomed to play and chat with Landry. He would seat himself under the trees where they had been in the habit of sitting together, and would bathe his feet in the brooks where they had paddled like two young ducks, happy if he found a stick fashioned by Landry, or a heap of flints which had served them for quoits or firestones. These he would gather together, concealing them in the decayed trunk of a tree, or beneath a pile of wood, that he might return to them as sacred relics. Thus he wandered about continually, puzzling his brains to retrace every trifling remembrance of past happiness, which to any other would have appeared valueless, but which to him was all important. Taking no heed for the future, wanting courage to encounter the thought of a succession of days like those he was now enduring, he lived but in the past, absorbed in a continual dream. I kind of get it. At times, Sylvanette would imagine he could see and hear his twin, and would talk to himself as if conversing with him. At others, he would fall asleep and dream of him, and awaking would cry to find himself alone, making no effort to restrain his tears because he hoped that sheer fatigue would, in the end, abate his sufferings. Once, wandering as far as the woods of Champeaux, he suddenly came upon the dried-up channel of a spring, which in the time of heavy rains flowed from the woods, and discovered one of those little mills which the children of these parts are famous for making, and which are so nicely constructed as to turn with the current of the water, frequently remaining for a long while until broken by other children or destroyed by the force of the stream. The one which Sylvanette now found had been there for more than 2 months, and as the place was lonely, it had escaped all injury. He quickly recognized it as the work of his twin, and recollected that when it was made they had promised themselves to return and see it, an intention lost sight of in the construction of other mills in different places. Yeah, we used to make forts. Sylvanette was therefore rejoiced at this discovery, and carried the mill down to the point whither the stream had retreated, that he might watch it turn in remembrance of an amusement Landry had taught him. And there he left it, promising himself the pleasure of returning on the following Sunday with Landry, that he also might see how their mill had resisted the influence of time. But he could not abstain from returning on the morrow, when he found the banks of the stream disturbed and tramped down by a drove of oxen, which had come thither to drink on their way to graze in a neighboring thicket. Bummer. Advancing a few steps, he saw that the animals had walked over his mill and had so shattered it to pieces that a few fragments only remained. At sight of this, his heart swelled within him, and imagining that some mischief to his twin was connected with this accident, he ran with all speed to La Priche to assure himself that nothing was wrong. But as he had observed that Landry did not like to be disturbed at his work, lest his master should be displeased, he contented himself with looking at him from a distance, and made no attempt to be seen. He would have been ashamed to confess the thought which had brought him thither, and therefore returned without saying a word or speaking of it to anyone for a long time after. Sylvanette grew pale, slept badly, and ate but little. His mother became alarmed and knew not how to treat him. She tried taking him with her to market and sending him to the cattle fair with his father and uncles, but he took no interest in what he did. At last his father, also being alarmed, without saying a word at home, endeavored to persuade Farmer Coyote to take both twins for a time into his service. But to this suggestion his friend returned an answer, the good sense of which he could not but so acknowledge. Suppose I were to take both as you wish, it could not last, for in families like ours, where one servant can do the work, two are not needed. At the end of a year you would have to send one of these boys away, and do you not see that if Sylvanette were in service, where he was obliged to work, he would not have leisure for vain regrets, but would yield to necessity like Landry, who is as good and industrious a boy as one need desire to see? Sooner or later it must come to this. You will not always be able to find him such a place as you could wish, and if these children are to be separated at all, the sooner it is done, the better. Be reasonable, old friend, and do not heed the caprice of a child, whom your wife and family have petted and spoiled. The most difficult step is taken, and trust me, Sylvanette will soon become reconciled if you do not yield. Farmer Barbeau saw the reasonableness of this, and felt that the more Sylvanette saw of his twin, the more he would naturally desire to see. He therefore determined at the approaching fête of St. John to try and procure him a situation where, seeing less and less of Landry, he might finally acquire the habit of living like the rest of the world and not allow himself to be overwhelmed by a restless and morbid attachment. But the time had not yet arrived to speak of this to Mother Barbeau, for at the first hint of sending Sylvanette away, she cried herself ill, declaring he would die, thus adding greatly to the worthy farmer's embarrassment. Landry, by the advice of his father and master, as well as that of his mother, did his best to reconcile his twin to his fate. Sylvanette, far from attempting any defense, promised all that was required, but ended by finding it impossible to conquer his grief. Another feeling mingled with his sorrow, of which he never spoke, since he knew not how to put it into words. This was a devouring jealousy which had sprung up in his heart with regard to Landry. Pleased as he was to find that everyone held his brother in esteem, and that his new masters treated him as affectionately as if he were one of their own children, he could not help being grieved and distressed to see Landry, as he thought, making too ardent a return to these new friendships. He could not endure that at the slightest word of Farmer Caillot, Landry should leave father, mother, and brother to do his bidding, more fearful of failing in his duty than in his affection, and more prompt to obey than Sylvanette would have found possible, when the remaining a few moments more with the dearest object of his affection was in question. Thus this poor child cherished a sorrow which he had never before experienced, in the belief that the love was all on his side, that his affection was but ill requited, and that this must have been the case from the first, though he had never suspected it, unless indeed the love of his twin had of late grown colder, since he had met elsewhere persons who pleased and suited him better. Yikes. I feel him. Not gonna explain further, but yeah, I get you, Sylvanette. I get all the feels. Bye.